A working-class boy, 8 weeks of schooling, bones shattered by tuberculosis. He built the loudest sound in the world from a garden shed. 350 workers, 4,000 cabinets a week. The amplifiers behind Hendrix at Woodstock, behind Clapton, behind Slash. In 1989, a corporation offered him £100 million for the company. He turned it down. It's the name that means something to me, because it is my name. He died in 2012. The company didn't stay his for long. Today, amplifiers are 5% of what Marshall earns. The rest is Bluetooth speakers, assembled by machine, in Asia. So how did it get here? The name he refused to sell is now worth 1.1 billion euros. The sound it was named for is an afterthought. This is not a story of failure. It is a story of what happens when a name becomes worth more than the thing that earned it, and what gets lost when nobody in the room remembers what the name was for. Chapter 1. The Boy in the Body. Cast. Jim Marshall was not supposed to be in this business. He was born on 29th July 1923 in West London. The exact neighborhood is disputed, Acton or Kensington, depending on which account you trust, but the world he was born into is not disputed at all. His father was a boxer who ran a fish and chips shop on Western Road in Southall. His mother was Beatrice. The family had boxers and music hall performers running through it like a seam through coal. A lineage built on performance, resilience, and knowing how to take a hit. Jim Marshall would need all of it. At the age of 5, he was diagnosed with tubercular bones, skeletal tuberculosis, which made his bones so fragile and so hypersensitive to pressure that ordinary childhood was impossible. He was placed in a full body cast, plaster from his ankles to his armpits, and admitted to the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital in Stanmore. He would spend years there. Accounts differ on how many. His biography says 9. Official records suggest until he was 13 or 14. What is not disputed is the cost. Jim Marshall managed 8 weeks of formal schooling in his entire childhood. 8 weeks. Not 8 years, 8 weeks. Consider what that meant for a working-class boy in interwar Britain. No qualifications. No trade apprenticeship. No route into any profession that required credentials. By every metric that mattered in the Britain of the 1930s, Jim Marshall had been written off before he began. His father refused that verdict. After Jim's recovery, he encouraged him to take up tap dancing, the logic being that rhythmic movement would strengthen the bones tuberculosis had ravaged. It was physical therapy disguised as performance. And it worked, though not in the way anyone expected. The tap dancing led Jim to the stage. The stage led him to music. Music would lead him to everything that followed. By 14, he was performing in local music halls 5 or 6 nights a week. He held a string of working-class jobs between performances: scrap metal yard, biscuit factory, shoe shop, electrical engineering at a ceramics plant. During the war, he later said he was earning as much at 14 as any adult. During the war, he sang with a jazz septet. And when the band's drummer was called up for military service in 1942, the other musicians talked Jim into sitting behind the kit. He became a drummer almost by accident. The accident would reshape British music for the next 80 years. His idol was Gene Krupa, the American jazz virtuoso, who had made the drum kit a lead instrument. From 1946 to 1948, Jim took weekly lessons from Max Abrams in Knightsbridge, learning Krupa's explosive, flamboyant style. he practiced relentlessly. By the end of the decade, he had become one of the most in-demand performing drummers in London. He even built his own portable PA system, his engineering instincts already surfacing, so his crooning vocals could be heard over the drums. He'd ride his bicycle with a trailer behind it, carrying his drum kit and the PA cabinets he'd built by hand, because wartime petrol rationing meant there were no cars. A man who'd spent years encased in plaster, pedaling across London in the blackout with a home-built sound system rattling behind him. That was Jim Marshall, at 23. Chapter 2. The Drum Shop on Uxbridge Road. By the early 1950s, Jim had found his second calling. He began giving drum lessons from his home in Southall, and word spread quickly. By 1949, he was teaching approximately 65 pupils every week. 65, that is more than 9 a day, 7 days a week. The quality of his teaching showed in who came through the door. Mitch Mitchell, who would go on to play with Jimi Hendrix. Mickey Waller, who would play with Little Richard and Jeff Beck. Mick Underwood, who would join the Outlaws alongside Ritchie Blackmore. These were not coincidences. Jim Marshall was producing professional-grade drummers because he was a professional-grade teacher, patient, exacting, and possessed of an ability to listen that would define everything he did. By 1960, he had so many students that he needed a shop. On July 7, 1960, Jim Marshall and his son Terry opened their doors at 76 Uxbridge Road in Hanwell, a suburb in the western reaches of London, unremarkable in every way except one. It sat at the geographic center of the emerging British electric blues scene. Less than 2 miles away, the Ealing Blues Club had just opened. The Who, the Rolling Stones, and Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated all passed through its doors. Pete Townshend was a regular customer. His father had played in bands with Jim. Keith Moon, one of Jim's drum students, practically lived there. Eric Clapton would sit in the shop practicing guitar for hours. Jim himself called it a sort of labor exchange for musicians of the day. Townshend told him directly, "We'd prefer to come to you than go to the West End, where we're treated like absolute idiots." The shop initially sold drums and accessories, but Jim's drum students had a habit of bringing their guitarists, and those guitarists, Townshend, Ritchie Blackmore, Big Jim Sullivan, all said the same thing in different ways. The American amplifiers available in Britain, primarily Fender, expensively imported at 3 months' wages for a working musician, were not loud enough, not dirty enough, not British enough. The sound they needed did not exist. Jim Marshall listened. He had no background in amplifier design. What he had was a service engineer named Ken Brann, a Pan American Airways technician who worked at Heathrow and played guitar on weekends. And through Brann, a contact, Dudley Craven, an 18-year-old electronics prodigy who worked days at EMI in Hayes and spent his evenings building radio transmitters in a garden shed behind his parents' house on Uxbridge Road. People at EMI called him the Whiz Kid. He and Brann knew each other through the Greenford Radio Club, where they attended Friday night meetings before heading to the Wimpy Bar in Ealing Broadway afterwards. Together, the three men began dismantling a Fender Bassman and substituting British components: Mullard tubes, Drake transformers, Celestion speakers. Each substitution changed the sound in ways nobody fully predicted. The work happened in Craven's garden shed, and in similar sheds belonging to Brann and a third recruit, Ken Underwood, another EMI apprentice, barely 16 years old, When Jim later suggested all three come and work for him full-time, Underwood's mother delivered a verdict that belongs in a museum. "Son, stay in your apprenticeship. There is no future in the pop music thing." He stayed at EMI. It took 6 attempts and 14 months. Prototype number 6 was demonstrated on a Sunday night in the autumn of 1962 at the Ealing Club. Terry Marshall played saxophone. Mitch Mitchell was on drums. Ken Brand held the amp at the back of the stage because it wasn't even in its case yet. The musicians in the room went quiet when they heard it. Then they went loud. 23 orders placed in the first week. Pete Townshend bought the first production amp for £110. Dudley Craven, the teenager who had designed it, was often found asleep at his workbench, exhausted from trying to keep up with demand while still working at EMI. He finally left to work for Jim full-time in July 1964. He died in 1998. The sound he created in a shack behind a pig farm is still being produced by hand in a factory in Bletchley more than 60 years later. The amp was named the JTM 45, James and Terry Marshall, 45 watts. Not because the name was poetic, because it was accurate. One idea, one sentence. The British guitarist deserved a British sound. That idea was worth rather more than anyone standing in that shop in 1962 could possibly know. Chapter 3, The Wall of Sound. The factory opened in June 1964. Silverdale Road, Hayes, 6,000 square feet. 16 workers, 20 amplifiers a week. Within 18 months, it was not enough. The demand arrived not gradually but like a tremor. In 1965, Pete Townshend came back to Jim Marshall with a complaint so precise it sounded like an engineering brief. The 50-watt head was not loud enough. He needed more power, more headroom, more everything. The first 100-watt prototypes used 4 KT66 valves with 2 50-watt Drake transformers, because no single 100-watt transformer existed yet. Within months, one had been sourced. The amp that would define stadium rock was born. Then Townshend wanted more. Not more watts, more speakers. He demanded an 8x12 cabinet, 8 12-inch speakers in a single enclosure. Jim warned him it would be impossibly heavy. Townshend's response entered Marshall folklore: "Sodom they get paid," meaning his roadies. Marshall built 6 of the 8x12 cabinets. They were first used on November 13th, 1965 at the Locomotive Club in Paris. After about 2 weeks, Townshend came back and admitted Jim had been right. The cabinets were too heavy to move. So Jim Marshall solved the problem with an idea so simple, it became the most recognizable visual icon in the history of popular music. He cut the 8x12 in half, an angled top 4x12 cabinet, a straight bottom 4x12 cabinet, the amplifier head perched on top of both, the Marshall stack. It has been in continuous production since 1965. No stage setup in rock music is more immediately identifiable. Not by design, by a roadie's bad back. That is the kind of accident history is made of. In late 1966, Jimi Hendrix arrived in London, brought over by his new manager, former Animals bassist Chaz Chandler. Mitch Mitchell, Jim's former drum student, the same Mitch Mitchell who had worked behind the counter at the Hanwell shop, who had played drums at the first Amps test gig at the Ealing Club, introduced Hendrix to Jim Marshall. On approximately 11th October, Hendrix walked into the shop and purchased 4 speaker cabinets and 3 100-watt Superlead amplifiers at full retail price. He insisted on it. "I gotta use your stuff, but I don't want anything given to me. I want to pay the full asking price." Jim, who had expected Hendrix to be another musician wanting something for nothing, was startled. Here was a man who respected the craft enough to pay for it. At Woodstock in August 1969, Hendrix used a pair of 1959 Marshall Superlead 100-watt heads and 3 full stacks. He described them as looking like a couple of great refrigerators. Jim Marshall called him the greatest ambassador we ever had. Hendrix is estimated to have owned between 50 and 100 Marshall amplifiers during his short career. Stand in front of a full Marshall stack when a guitarist finds the sweet spot. Volume cranked to the edge of feedback. The tubes pushed to the threshold of distortion. You do not just hear it, you feel it, a warmth spreading across the chest, a pressure behind the eyes, a vibration that passes through bone and keeps going. What you are feeling is the harmonic content of the valves interacting, the controlled imperfection of a circuit pushed to its limit, producing a sound that is technically distorted and emotionally perfect. The Marshall sound is not a frequency response curve. It is a physical event. That physical authority, that tingle, was what the Bletchley factory produced by the thousand every week. Revenue in 1965, £82,000. Revenue in 1968, £380,000. Revenue in 1972, £1.2 million. Revenue in 1975, £4.4 million. Revenue in 1979, £7.1 million. By 1970, 350 workers. 2 Queen's Awards for export. Marshall amplifiers on virtually every defining recording of the rock era. Led Zeppelin's entire catalog. Clapton's Blues Breakers album. The record that had started everything when Eric Clapton plugged his 1960 Gibson Les Paul Standard into a Marshall 1962 combo and recorded what became known as the Beano album, so named because Clapton was reading a Beano comic on the cover. Slash's work on Appetite for Destruction, Angus Young's assault on stadiums from Sydney to Stockholm, Eddie Van Halen, who ran a stock 1967 Marshall Superlead through a variac transformer to coax a particular kind of saturated sustain from the EL34 power valves, and built the first 6 Van Halen albums on a tone produced by a 20-year-old amplifier designed in a garden shed in Hanwell. Among the workers building all of it, Terry Watts, wiring technician, who joined the Bletchley factory in 1971 at the age of 19. On his first day on the floor, a foreman plugged a completed 100-watt head into a cabinet and turned it up. Terry Watts later described the moment simply, "I felt it in my teeth. I thought something had gone wrong. Then I realized that was it. That was what we were building." He would stay for 31 years. And Margaret Holloway, cabinet finisher, who joined in 1974 and spent 26 years applying the black Tolex vinyl covering to Marshall cabinets by hand, a technique requiring precise tension on each corner, learned over months and never quite teachable from a manual. At peak production, she finished 42 cabinets a week. None of them bore her name. All of them bore Jim Marshall's. And underneath all of it, a 15-year contract was quietly ticking. Chapter 4. The Worst Deal Ever Made. In 1965, Jim Marshall made the decision that would define, distort, and very nearly destroy the first 2 decades of his empire. He signed with Rose Morris and Company. The context matters. In 1965, Marshall was producing amplifiers that had captured Britain. But Britain was not the world. Jimi Hendrix was about to cross the Atlantic. Led Zeppelin was forming. Jim Marshall needed global distribution, and Rose Morris, an established British instrument distributor, offered it. The contract ran for 15 years. It gave Rose Morris exclusive worldwide distribution rights for every Marshall amplifier produced. In exchange, Marshall received working capital and access to an established retail network. On paper, it was logical. In practice, it was a disaster. Rose Morris added 55% to Marshall's factory gate price before selling to retailers. Not 5%, not 15%, 55%. In the United States, in the largest music equipment market in the world, the result was amplifiers priced at nearly double what American competitors charged. Fender and Gibson could reach the working musician. A Marshall stack in the United States was a luxury item, accessible only to professional touring acts. And the mass market was closed for 15 years. Jim Marshall would describe it later with characteristic directness. The biggest mistake I ever made. Rose Morris hadn't a clue, really. The damage extended beyond pricing. Rose Morris controlled how Marshall products were presented, named, and categorized. They refused to use the word stack, insisting on the term setup in all marketing materials. They assigned model numbers from their own internal catalog, which is why the legendary 1962 Bluesbreaker combo bears a year in its name that has nothing to do with when it was built. It was item number 1962 in the Rose Morris catalog. A product that changed British blues guitar is named after a distributor's filing system. To maintain relationships with dealers that Rose Morris had frozen out, including his old friend Johnny Jones, Jim Marshall was quietly forced to build a series of parallel product lines under false names. Park Amplifiers, named after distributor Johnny Jones's wife's maiden name. Narb Amplifiers, Ken Brand's name spelled backwards. Kitchen Marshall, CMI, identical products to the real Marshall range. Same chassis, same circuits, same sound, different nameplates, sold discreetly out of the back door of his own empire. For 15 years, Britain's most famous amplifier manufacturer was hiding its own products under assumed identities. But the amps kept selling. The records kept selling. The stack kept appearing on stages around the world. And the profits, reduced as they were, kept arriving. The crisis was not visible. Not yet. Nothing could possibly go wrong. That is always the most dangerous thought in business. Chapter 5. The Liberation and Its Limits. In 1981, the Rose Morris contract expired. Jim Marshall did not renew it. He had been counting the days. Within months, he relaunched the amplifier line under a new name, the JCM 800. James Charles Marshall, his full name, and the personalized number plate on his Jaguar. Full-width gold control panel. Jim Marshall's signature across the front, establishing a look as recognizable as the Coca-Cola script. A new aesthetic for a new decade. Underneath it, circuits evolved from what Dudley Craven had built in the garden shed. Not revolutionary. Better. Without Rose Morris adding its 55% margin, the pricing difference was dramatic. In the United States alone, Sales increased 360% in 3 years. Marshall amplifiers became accessible for the first time to an entire generation of musicians who had been priced out for 15 years. Punk bands, new wave acts, the embryonic British heavy metal scene. The amp that Jimi Hendrix had played was suddenly within reach of a 20-year-old saving up from a part-time job. The JCM 800 was adopted almost instantly. Its tight, compressed gain, a sound sometimes described as controlled aggression, became the defining amplifier tone of 1980s rock. Slash used it. Dave Mustaine built Megadeth around it. Entire genres were constructed on its particular character. 1984, another Queen's Award for Export. 1987, the Silver Jubilee Series, a limited production amplifier draped in silver Tolex, trimmed in chrome, released to commemorate Jim Marshall's 50th year in the music business. The 2555 head, one of the most sought-after collector's pieces in amplifier history. Revenue was recovering. The company was expanding. Jim Marshall received the OBE. He placed his handprints in the Hollywood Rock Walk, alongside Leo Fender, Les Paul, and Eddie Van Halen. In 1989, Harman International offered Jim £100 million for the company, plus a 15-year personal contract at $1 million per year. He owned 100% of the business. There were no shareholders to consult. He could have retired to a life of Monte Cristo cigars and single malt scotch, two of his documented pleasures, with enough left over for several lifetimes. He refused. What would I do with the millions? You can only live in one house, drive one car, and eat one good meal a day. Anyway, I'm happy working. I've been a workaholic since the age of 14, and it's the name that means something to me, because it is my name. The future looked secure. But a different question was gathering quietly in the background. A question nobody at Marshall was asking. What happens when a company built entirely around one man's taste is no longer guided by that man's taste? Jim Marshall was in his 60s. The factory was his. The product decisions were his. The 15-year ordeal of Rose Morris had, paradoxically, reinforced his instinct for total personal control. He had seen what happened when someone else managed his business. He had no interest in repeating that experiment. But control and succession are not the same thing. And the world Marshall had built the brand for, the world of tube amplifiers, of loud guitar music, of stadiums filled with the physical authority of 4 12-inch speakers, was beginning to change in ways that were very hard to see from inside the Bletchley factory. The digital revolution was not yet visible, but it was already being assembled in a laboratory in Agoura Hills, California. Chapter 6. The Invisible Cracks. By 1995, Marshall was still the most recognizable name in guitar amplification. Still producing amplifiers in Bletchley, still employing hundreds, still putting the gold script on the black cabinet and shipping it around the world. But 3 forces were converging, and the profits were still good enough, the brand still strong enough, that nobody inside the building was asking the questions they needed to ask. The first force was demographic. The guitarists who had grown up with Marshall stacks, who had saved for them, carried them up flights of stairs at midnight after gigs, felt those cabinets in their chests, were aging. The next generation was different. They practiced in bedrooms. They recorded at home on computers. They needed versatility, portability, and quietly convincing digital simulations of vintage tones. Not a 100-watt stack that could strip plaster from walls. The second force was the technology that arrived to serve them. In 1996, Line 6 launched in Agoura Hills, California. Their first product was the Axis 212, a modeling amplifier, not a valve amp, not trying to be a valve amp. It used digital signal processing to emulate the sound of classic amplifiers, including prominently Marshall amplifiers, without a single glass valve in the circuit. 2 years later, Line 6 released the pod, red, kidney bean shaped. It sat on a desktop. It emulated 15 classic amp models. It plugged directly into a recording interface. It didn't need a 4x12 cabinet. It didn't need to be loud. And it sounded to an increasingly large number of guitarists close enough. Those two words carried more destructive force than any competing amplifier manufacturer ever had. Because Marshall's business had always been built on the premise that there was no substitute for the real thing. The pod didn't challenge that premise with a better version of the same thing. It challenged the premise itself. Marshall's internal response was the Valve State series, a hybrid design using transistor preamp stages with a single tube in the output section. The tube purists were not persuaded. The digital converts were not persuaded. The product sat between two audiences and satisfied neither. The third force, and the one nobody read correctly at the time, was the licensing deal. In 2010, the company signed an agreement with Zund Industries, a Swedish consumer electronics company, licensing the Marshall name for Bluetooth speakers and lifestyle headphones. The consumer market had been eyeing the Marshall aesthetic for years. The black vinyl, the gold script, the speaker grill cloth, as a cultural statement. Zund brought Marshall to people who had never played guitar. Students in Stockholm, urban commuters, fashion-conscious consumers who associated the Marshall badge with a certain kind of rebellious, analog cool. The licensing deal generated revenue almost immediately. Clean, margin-rich, royalty-based revenue that required no manufacturing investment, no valve procurement, no skilled wiring technicians. That profit was the signal nobody read correctly. When a brand's name becomes worth more in consumer electronics than in the product the brand was built on, something fundamental has shifted. The name has become larger than the company. The logo has outgrown the thing it was designed to describe. On the forums where guitarists gathered, Marshall Amp Forum, the Gear page, Talkbase, Strat Talk, users were asking questions that should have kept Marshall's management awake at night. If you want a real Marshall, there's only Friedman and Seriatone anyway. Dave Friedman, based in Los Angeles, had built his entire reputation by doing what Marshall wouldn't, hot-rodding Marshall circuits into what modern players actually wanted. The company that had been founded because Jim Marshall listened to Pete Townshend and Ritchie Blackmore had, somewhere along the way, stopped listening to anyone. Jim Marshall died on the 5th of April 2012 at Wellington Hospital, London. He was 88 years old. He had received the OBE in 2003, honorary doctorates from 3 universities. He kept a drum kit in his office until near the end. He would catch planes in his 70s to watch Iron Maiden play live. The boy who had been encased in plaster until he was 13, who had tap danced to strengthen his shattered bones, who had built his own PA system and pedaled it across wartime London on a bicycle. Now that boy was still in there, still listening, still keeping time. He left behind a factory, a workforce, a brand, and a question none of his heirs could easily answer. What does Marshall sell, if not the sound? Chapter 7. The Convergence. The collapse did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a convergence. 5 forces compounding each other, each one making the others worse, arriving close enough together that the business had no room between them. The first was structural. The global market for guitar amplifiers contracted by 34% between 2000 and 2020, driven by the shift to digital modeling and home recording. Marshall's product line was 95% valve-based. It was swimming upstream in a current that was not going to reverse. The second was competitive. In 2012, the Kemper Profiler arrived. Its technology was different from Line 6's modeling. Instead of simulating generic amp types, it profiled specific real amplifiers, capturing the sonic fingerprint of an individual unit with precision that made experienced engineers struggle in blind tests to tell the profile from the original. You could profile your favorite vintage Marshall Plexi and carry it in a lunchbox-sized unit, direct to the mixing desk, no stage volume, no microphone placement, no feedback. Fractal Audio's AXE-FX had been building professional credibility since 2006. The Line 6 Helix, launched in 2015, reached unambiguously professional quality. Guitar World's 2025 marketplace data showed not a single valve guitar amplifier in the top 10 sellers. The market had not just shifted, it had migrated. The third was the licensing paradox. By 2020, Marshall-branded headphones and Bluetooth speakers, the Stanmore, the Woburn, the Acton, the Kilburn, sold through 20,000 retail locations in more than 90 countries, generated more revenue than Marshall amplifiers. The consumer electronics business was profitable. The amplifier business was not. When the family and its investors looked at the two lines of the business, the economics pointed in one direction. The fourth was the pandemic. In 2020, the global live music industry shut down entirely for 18 months. Guitar retail contracted. Music equipment manufacturers who had been managing decline began managing emergency. The fifth, and in some ways the most consequential, was succession. Jim Marshall had been the brand, not a steward of it, the brand itself. His taste, his relationships, his insistence on certain things being non-negotiable. These were not systems written down anywhere. When he died in 2012, the company had the name without the man. His children held their stake and sat on the board. But neither was Jim. No one was Jim. Not through one catastrophe, not through bad management alone, not through a single missed technology bet or a single disastrous deal. Through convergence. Through a constellation of forces that, taken individually, seemed manageable and taken together, made the outcome almost inevitable. By 2022, amplifiers accounted for 5% of Marshall's combined revenue. 5%. Chapter 8. The Deals That Changed Everything. March 30th, 2023. Marshall Amplification has been sold to Zund Industries. The Swedish technology company that had been licensing the Marshall name for consumer electronics for 13 years now owns the name outright. The Marshall family retains a 24% stake in the new entity, called the Marshall Group. The deal values the combined business at revenues exceeding $360 million. Jeremy de Millard, Zund's CEO, takes the helm. He is not from the music industry. He comes from the world of Vans, Adidas, the North Face. He gives interviews in which he promises to overinvest in the amplifier side of the business, to close the gap with digital competitors, to preserve the heritage. Max Martin, the Swedish pop hitmaker behind records for Britney Spears, Taylor Swift, and The Weeknd, holds a 0.5% stake in the new entity. The people who now own Marshall Amplification come from fashion brands, venture capital, pop music, and consumer electronics. Not one of them has ever hand-wired a turret board. The global guitar community's response is immediate. On Telecaster Guitar Forum, it's just a brand now. On Kemper Profiler Forum, Marshall is now controlled by a lifestyle accessories company. What could possibly go wrong? On Talkbase, nobody cared when the perpetually mismanaged, declining quality brand was sold by the family to a private equity firm. The comparison that spreads fastest across the forums is not lost on anyone who knows guitar history. Fender and CBS. In 1965, Leo Fender, exhausted, ill, believing he had a terminal diagnosis, sold his company to the Columbia Broadcasting System for $13 million. CBS treated Fender as a cash cow, cut production quality, and spent 15 years eroding the brand's credibility before a management buyout in 1985 rescued it. The CBS Fender era was the cautionary tale that every guitar manufacturer's customer base carried in their collective memory, and now Marshall's customers were reaching for it. The Marshall Group had barely settled into its new structure when the next blow arrived. January 2025, the NAMM show, Anaheim, California. Marshall Group returns to the trade event for the first time in 5 years. The announcement from the booth is not about a new amplifier. China's Hongshan Capital Group, formerly Sequoia China, manager of more than $55 billion in global assets, early investor in ByteDance, Alibaba, and Canva, has agreed to acquire a majority stake in the Marshall Group. The deal is valued at 1.1 billion euros. Hongshan's largest European investment, a multi-tranche loan of 475 million euros, arranged through HSBC, UBS, and Standard Chartered. The Marshall family stake falls to approximately 20%. In under 2 years, Marshall has been sold twice. In under 63 years, what began as a family business at 76 Uxbridge Road in Hanwell, one drum teacher, one electronics prodigy, one idea about the sound the British guitarist deserved, has passed through Jim Marshall, through Rose Morris, back to Jim Marshall, to a Swedish technology conglomerate, to a Chinese private equity firm managing $55 billion in assets. Hongshan's managing director for Europe offered his own framing for the acquisition. Our mission is to support Marshall in unlocking its full potential by leveraging our expertise in digital channels and supply chain optimization. Digital channels. Supply chain optimization. Not valves, not transformers, not the hand-wired turret boards that Dudley Craven designed in a garden shed. The vocabulary had changed. That alone told you everything about what had changed. The promise is still being made as it has always been made. The heritage will be preserved. The amplifiers will be honored. The Bletchley factory will continue. It is always the same promise. Chapter 9. The human cost of the deal that wasn't theirs. Terry Watts retired from the Bletchley factory in 2002 after 31 years. He had started as a wiring technician in 1971, learned chassis dressing, moved to quality control, spent his last decade as a shift supervisor. When he joined, Marshall employed 280 people in Bletchley. When he left, the head count was roughly the same. He was not asked about the Sound deal. He was not asked about the Hongshan deal. Neither was Margaret Holloway, who had hand-finished 54,288 cabinets. She kept count before her retirement in 2000. What those workers understood about the Marshall sound is not transferable. It lives in the hands and the eyes of people who have done something 10,000 times. Margaret Holloway's ability to apply black Tolex to a cabinet corner with the precise tension that prevents air pockets is not in a manual anywhere. Terry Watts could identify a poorly biased output stage by the sound of the amplifier at 3 watts without instruments. One visitor to the factory in the 1990s noted that the hand wiring section was entirely staffed by women. When asked about it, they laughed. "You blokes just bollocks things up." That institutional knowledge is now mostly retired. Some of it is gone. A University of Huddersfield research team visiting Bletchley in 2025 as part of a £5 million Lever Trust-funded amplification project described the factory floor in terms that would have been familiar in 1975. Circuit boards being soldiered, cabinets being carved, Tolex being applied, the complex mix of automated processes and finely honed handiwork that has characterized the place since the 1960s side by side in the same building. The past and the future, sharing a postcode. The executives who sold the stakes in the Zund and Hongshan deals walked away with the value of a company whose name was worth 1.1 billion euros. A name that was worth 1.1 billion euros. Because men like Terry Watts and women like Margaret Holloway spent 30 years making products that deserved to carry it. Terry Watts walked away with his pension. Margaret Holloway received a letter and a clock. The Hongshan partner who authorized the 1.1 billion euro acquisition had never been to Bletchley. His due diligence listed 800 employees. They appear as a line in the operational cost model. There is no public record of what the last day of manufacturing under family ownership felt like on the Bletchley floor. Nobody collected those testimonies. Nobody recorded those conversations. The workers who built the amplifiers that Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, and Jimmy Page plugged into vanished from the story as completely as if they had never been part of it. They made the thing the logo was worth €1 billion for. That is the measure of what changed. Not the logo. The logo is fine. The logo is on a €1 billion balance sheet. What changed is the answer to the question Jim Marshall spent his entire career ensuring could only be answered one way. Who is this company for? Chapter 10. What remains and what is gone? The factory in Bletchley still operates. Amplifiers are still made there. The JVM series, the Origin series, the DSL series. The tubes still glow orange through the ventilation slots. The transformers still hum at 50 Hz. The black Tolex covering is still stretched over pine cabinet frames by workers whose hands know every corner. That much has survived. At NAMM 2025, Marshall debuted the Modified Series, a factory hot-rodded JCM 800 at $3,299 and a 1959 Plexi, modified at $3,699. Hand-built at Bletchley with gain boost, clipping, and tonal switching built in. Guitar World's verdict: the same great JCM 800, but with the modifications that players had been asking for 20 years. A significant U.S. price reduction of approximately 30% arrived in mid-2024 when Marshall Group took over American distribution directly, finally removing the kind of middleman markup that had crippled the business under Rose Morris half a century earlier. In the entrance hall of the Bletchley factory, behind glass, sits prototype number 1, the very first JTM 45. The chassis that Dudley Craven wired in his Radio Shack. The amp that Terry Marshall and Mitch Mitchell tested at the Ealing Club. The one that Pete Townshend bought for 110 pounds. The one that pulled 23 orders on its first day in the shop window. It has not been plugged in for decades. A few feet away, circuit boards for portable Bluetooth speakers are automatically populated at 6 components per second. The company that built those amplifiers is no longer a British family business in any meaningful sense. It is a division of a Swedish incorporated group, majority owned by a Chinese private equity firm, managing $55 billion in assets. Its CEO is a consumer electronics executive from Stockholm. Its primary revenue stream is Bluetooth speakers and wireless headphones. Its amplifier revenue accounts for 5 cents on every dollar. But the lesson in the Marshall story is not simply about corporate greed or private equity or the predatory economics of brand licensing. Those things are present. They are not the whole story. The real lesson is older than any of the deals. It is the lesson at the heart of every empire built by one extraordinary person. What a founder builds, the market will eventually price. Jim Marshall built something that could not be separated from his personal authority, his taste, his refusal to compromise, the thing he knew was right. The day he signed the Rose Morris deal, the worst deal he ever made, he learned what it costs to hand a piece of that authority to someone who does not share your obsession. He spent 15 years paying for that lesson. His heirs spent 60 years learning the rest of it. In 1989, he turned down £100 million because the name was his name. In 2025, a Chinese private equity firm paid 1.1 billion euros for the same name. The name survived. The question is what the name now describes. The first amplifier Jim Marshall ever built sits today in the Marshall Museum in Bletchley. It is not beautiful. It is not elegant. It is a collection of hand-selected British components soldered together by a teenager in a garden shed on Uxbridge Road, assembled by 3 men who had never built an amplifier before and were simply trying to give Pete Townshend the sound he said he needed. It has no logo, no Bluetooth capability, no investor roadmap, just the thing itself, the sound, and that, finally, is what the €1 billion valuation was always really for.